Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 1. The first light of morning filtered gently through the towering cedar trees. Golden sunbeams slipped between their ancient branches, painting soft patterns across the forest floor. Ethan followed the narrow woodland trail at an unhurried pace. Behind him, Lavender Valley had disappeared beneath the morning mist, yet its peaceful fragrance seemed to linger within his heart. The little wooden windmill rested safely inside his backpack, beside every keepsake from his journey. The smooth river stones, the white seashell, the pale blue sea glass, the brass compass, the carved pine cone, the dried lavender. Each memory reminded him that every peaceful place had quietly changed him. The forest welcomed him with silence. Not an empty silence, but one filled with gentle life. Tall cedar trees stretched high into the sky. Their trunks were wide and weathered by countless seasons. Soft moss covered their roots like emerald carpets. Tiny ferns grew beside the winding trail. The cool air carried the fresh scent of cedar wood mixed with damp earth. Every breath felt wonderfully refreshing. High above, birds sang their cheerful morning songs. A pair of red squirrels darted playfully between the branches. Somewhere in the distance, Ethan heard something new. A faint sound. Soft, steady, like nature whispering. He stopped walking, closed his eyes, and listened carefully. S-H-H-H-H-H. Rush. S-H-H-H-H-H. Rush. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a river. It was the distant sound of falling water. A waterfall. The sound was gentle, almost inviting, as though the forest itself was guiding him toward it. Curious, Ethan continued deeper into the cedar woods. The trail became narrower. Sunlight danced across patches of wildflowers growing beneath the trees. White mushrooms clustered beside fallen logs. Blue butterflies drifted lazily through shafts of golden light. Tiny birds hopped across smooth stones before disappearing into the undergrowth. The forest felt ancient, protected, peaceful. After nearly an hour of walking, Ethan reached a small wooden sign. Its carved letters had faded with time. Whispering Falls. Below the words someone had carved another message. Asterisk, walk softly. The forest is listening. Asterisk. Ethan smiled. He gently placed one hand upon the weathered sign before continuing. Soon the sound of falling water became clearer. Rush, rush, rush. The cool air grew even fresher. A fine mist drifted through the trees. The path curved around a cluster of giant cedar trunks. Then, the forest suddenly opened. Before Ethan stood one of the most beautiful places he had ever seen. A crystal clear waterfall cascaded gracefully over smooth gray cliffs. The water fell in gentle ribbons into a turquoise pool below. Sunlight caught the drifting mist, creating a delicate rainbow that shimmered above the water. Wildflowers bloomed along the rocky banks. Ferns covered every stone. Tiny birds drank from the edge of the pool. The entire place felt untouched by time. Hidden, sacred, peaceful. Ethan stood quietly, listening to the endless melody of the falling water. The waterfall did not roar. It whispered, as though telling an old story only patient travelers could hear. He smiled gently. Somehow, he knew another unforgettable chapter of his journey had just begun. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 2, Ethan remained standing beside the crystal-clear pool. The waterfall flowed gently before him, not with thunder, not with force, but with a soft, endless whisper. Rush, pause, rush, pause. The cool mist drifted across the water, touching his face like a gentle morning breeze. Sunlight filtered through the towering cedar trees overhead. As each ray met the floating mist, tiny rainbows appeared and disappeared above the pool. It felt almost magical. Small fish glided peacefully beneath the crystal-clear surface. Smooth stones rested quietly at the bottom, polished by years of flowing water. Dragonflies hovered gracefully above the edge of the pool. Their delicate wings shimmered with shades of blue and emerald. Ethan knelt beside the water. He dipped his fingertips into the pool. The water was cool, fresh, wonderfully clear. Gentle ripples spread across the surface before slowly disappearing. For several peaceful minutes, he simply listened. The waterfall, the birds, the whispering cedar branches. Each sound blended perfectly with the others. Nothing competed. Everything belonged. Then, he noticed something unusual. Across the pool, hidden among moss-covered rocks, stood a tiny wooden footbridge. Beyond it, a narrow path disappeared into the forest. Beside the bridge hung a small wooden wind chime. Whenever the breeze passed through the valley, it sang softly. Chime, pause, chime, pause. Its gentle melody blended beautifully with the waterfall. Curious, Ethan crossed the stepping stones that led toward the bridge. The old cedar planks creaked quietly beneath his footsteps. At the far end of the bridge stood a small cottage built entirely from cedar wood. Its roof was covered with soft green moss. Wild ivy climbed its walls. Flower boxes overflowed with white daisies, bluebells, and tiny forest violets. A thin ribbon of smoke rose peacefully from the stone chimney. Someone lived here. Near the cottage, an elderly man carefully watered a small herb garden. His silver hair rested beneath a weathered cedar hat. He wore a simple forest green coat and sturdy leather boots. At his feet lay a large golden retriever, peacefully sleeping in the morning sun. The old man looked up and smiled. I wondered when another traveler would arrive. His voice was calm, warm, as gentle as the waterfall itself. Ethan smiled politely. My name is Ethan. The old man nodded. I know. The forest has been expecting you. Ethan blinked with quiet surprise. You know my name? The man chuckled softly. Benjamin's letter arrived yesterday morning. He reached into his coat pocket and held up the envelope sealed with purple wax. The seal had already been opened. I am Samuel, the keeper of Whispering Falls. I've known Benjamin for more than 40 years. He said a thoughtful traveler would soon follow the cedar trail. Ethan smiled. So that was the letter Benjamin had asked him not to open until reaching his next destination. Samuel carefully folded it and returned it to his pocket. Benjamin always sends kind people, and kind people are always welcome here. The golden retriever slowly opened its eyes. It stood, stretched lazily, and walked over to Ethan with a gentle wag of its tail. Samuel smiled. This is Cedar. He has greeted every traveler for the past 11 years. Cedar quietly rested beside Ethan, as though they had already become friends. Samuel looked toward the waterfall. Many people come here hoping to hear something extraordinary. He smiled gently. But the waterfall teaches a different lesson. It reminds us, that even the softest voice can remain strong enough to shape stone. Ethan looked at the smooth rocks beneath the falling water. Every edge had been rounded by countless years of gentle flow, not through force, but through patience. Samuel nodded. "Come, I'll make some cedar needle tea. There's a quiet porch where the waterfall sounds even more beautiful." Together, Ethan, Samuel, and Cedar followed the moss-covered path toward the cozy wooden cottage, while behind them, Whispering Falls continued telling its timeless story, one gentle drop at a time. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 3, Samuel gently opened the cedar cottage door. A pleasant scent of warm wood, pine resin, and fresh herbs drifted into the cool morning air. Ethan stepped inside. The cottage was simple, yet beautifully welcoming. Sunlight poured through wide wooden windows, filling the room with a soft golden glow. Every piece of furniture had been handcrafted from cedar. A round wooden table stood beside the window. 2 rocking chairs faced the waterfall outside. Shelves filled with well-worn books lined one wall. Bundles of dried herbs hung neatly from the ceiling beams. Their gentle fragrance blended with the fresh scent of cedar wood. In the corner, a stone fireplace crackled quietly. Crackle, pause, crackle, pause. Its warm glow made the cottage feel even more peaceful. Cedar, the gentle golden retriever, settled comfortably on a woven rug beside the fire. Samuel smiled. He always chooses the warmest place in the house. Ethan laughed softly. I can see why. Samuel placed a small iron kettle over the fire. He carefully added fresh cedar needles, wild mint, chamomile flowers, and a slice of forest-grown lemon. Soon, steam rose gently from the kettle. The soothing aroma filled the cottage. It smelled clean, refreshing, almost like the forest itself. As the tea steeped, Samuel opened one of the windows. The sound of Whispering Falls flowed gently into the room. Rush, pause, rush, pause. It has been my favorite music for many years, Samuel said. I've never grown tired of hearing it. He poured the warm tea into 2 handcrafted clay cups. The tea shimmered with a light golden green color. Ethan took a careful sip. The flavor was delicate, fresh, calming. It carried a hint of mint, a touch of citrus, and the clean taste of cedar. Samuel noticed Ethan smiling. The forest has its own recipes. It shares them with anyone willing to slow down. For a while, they sat quietly on the porch. The rocking chairs moved gently back and forth. Above them, cedar branches swayed in the breeze. Below, the waterfall continued its endless song. Several hummingbirds darted among clusters of wildflowers growing near the porch. Their tiny wings shimmered like jewels in the sunlight. A family of deer appeared briefly at the edge of the forest. They drank from the stream below the waterfall before quietly disappearing back into the trees. Nothing in the forest seemed afraid. Everything moved with quiet confidence. Samuel reached for a small leather notebook resting on the table. Its cover had been carved with the image of a waterfall surrounded by cedar trees. I've kept this journal for nearly 30 years, he said. I don't write about important events. I write about peaceful moments. He turned a few pages. One entry simply read, Asterisk, this morning, a robin sang before sunrise. The waterfall answered with its endless whisper. Asterisk. Another page said, Asterisk, the first autumn leaf landed upon the bridge today. The forest welcomed another season. Asterisk, Ethan smiled. They're so simple. Samuel nodded. The smallest moments are often the easiest to overlook. And yet, they're usually the ones we remember the longest. Ethan thought about his own journey. He hadn't remembered every mile of every trail, but he remembered the gentle sound of Oliver's Lake, the warm light of the lonely lighthouse, the lavender carried by the evening breeze, and now, the quiet whisper of the waterfall. Samuel closed the notebook. This afternoon, he said with a gentle smile, I'd like to show you something very few visitors ever see. It's hidden deep within the cedar forest, a place where the waterfall begins its journey. Ethan's eyes brightened with curiosity. The source of Whispering Falls, hidden somewhere among the ancient cedar trees. Another peaceful discovery awaited. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 4. The afternoon sun rested high above the cedar forest. Golden light filtered through the towering branches, creating moving patterns across the moss-covered trail. After finishing their tea, Samuel placed the little leather journal into his satchel. Cedar stood, stretched lazily, and wagged his tail. I suppose he's ready, Samuel said with a smile. He never misses this walk. Together, the three companions left the cozy cottage. The narrow path followed the stream that flowed away from Whispering Falls. The water sparkled beneath the sunlight, weaving gently between smooth gray stones. Every few steps, tiny wooden footbridges crossed the stream. Each one had been carefully built by hand. The forest grew quieter as they walked. Only the sounds of nature remained. The rustling cedar branches, the gentle stream, the cheerful songs of hidden birds, and the soft footsteps upon the forest floor. The air became cooler, thicker with the fresh scent of cedar and damp moss. Ancient trees surrounded them on every side. Some were so wide that it would take 4 people holding hands to reach around their trunks. Samuel gently rested one hand on one of the oldest trees. This cedar has stood here for nearly 400 years. Ethan looked up in amazement. Its branches disappeared high into the forest canopy. Tiny beams of sunlight slipped between the needles, filling the air with floating specks of golden light. It has witnessed storms, Samuel continued. Long winters, warm summers, and thousands of quiet mornings. He smiled, yet it has never hurried. Ethan quietly touched the rough bark. The tree felt strong, steady, timeless. A little farther along the trail, they reached a circle of enormous cedar trees. Their branches stretched together high above, forming a natural canopy. In the center stood a smooth stone bench covered with soft green moss. The forest here felt different, even quieter. Samuel lowered his voice. The villagers call this place the Circle of Listening. No one comes here to speak. They come here to hear. Ethan sat upon the moss-covered bench. At first, he heard only the distant waterfall. Then, the breeze moving gently through thousands of cedar needles. A woodpecker tapping somewhere deep within the forest. The flutter of wings overhead. The tiny rustle of squirrels gathering pine cones. Even his own breathing became part of the forest's peaceful rhythm. Samuel smiled knowingly. The forest is never truly silent. It simply speaks softly. They remained there for several peaceful minutes. No conversation, no hurry, only quiet awareness. When they finally continued, the path became steeper. The stream beside them grew narrower and clearer. Small waterfalls trickled over smooth rocks, creating tiny melodies of their own. Wild orchids bloomed among the moss. Bright green ferns unfurled beneath fallen logs. Blue butterflies floated lazily through shafts of sunlight. Suddenly, Cedar stopped. His ears perked up. He looked toward a cluster of bushes beside the stream. A moment later, a graceful doe stepped quietly into the clearing. Behind her came two tiny fawns. They paused beside the water, drinking peacefully. Neither Samuel nor Ethan moved. Neither spoke. The little family remained for several minutes before disappearing silently into the forest. Samuel smiled softly. They know this place is safe. The forest rewards those who walk gently. Ethan watched the bushes sway as the deer vanished from sight. His heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. The stream continued, leading them higher into the mountains. Its gentle flow became stronger with every step. Samuel pointed ahead. We're getting close. The place where every drop of Whispering Falls begins. It isn't marked on any map. It belongs only to the forest. As the afternoon light softened beneath the towering cedar trees, Ethan followed Samuel deeper into the ancient woodland, toward a hidden spring that had quietly nourished the forest for centuries. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall in the Cedar Forest. Part 5. The trail became narrower with every step. Towering cedar trees stood so close together that their branches formed a living roof above the path. Only thin ribbons of sunlight reached the forest floor. The air felt cooler here, fresh, pure, filled with the gentle scent of cedar, moss, and flowing water. Samuel walked slowly, his weathered walking stick tapping softly against the smooth stones. Tap, pause, tap, pause. Cedar trotted happily beside him, occasionally stopping to sniff the wildflowers that grew along the edge of the trail. The stream beside them had changed. It was no longer wide and calm. Now it danced playfully over polished rocks, forming dozens of tiny cascades. Each one sang its own quiet melody. Together, they sounded like a peaceful orchestra hidden within the forest. Ethan smiled. It feels as though the forest is alive. Samuel looked back with kind eyes. It is. Every tree, every stream, every bird. They all belong to the same quiet conversation. After another gentle climb, they reached a fallen cedar tree stretching across the stream like a natural bridge. Its trunk was covered in soft emerald moss. Tiny mushrooms grew along its sides like miniature umbrellas. Samuel stepped carefully across. Ethan followed. The moss felt surprisingly soft beneath his boots. On the other side, the forest opened into a small clearing unlike anything Ethan had seen before. Sunlight poured through an opening in the canopy, illuminating hundreds of tiny white wildflowers. They covered the forest floor like a blanket of stars. Butterflies drifted peacefully from flower to flower. Bees hummed lazily in the warm afternoon air. At the center of the clearing stood a single giant cedar tree. Its trunk was enormous. Its bark carried the marks of countless seasons. Its branches reached high into the sky, disappearing among the clouds of green needles above. Samuel removed his hat. We call this the Grand Cedar. My grandfather believed it was already old when his own grandfather was a child. Ethan slowly walked toward the magnificent tree. He gently placed one hand upon its rough bark. It felt warm beneath the afternoon sun. Strong, steady, endless. A gentle breeze stirred the branches high above. Thousands of cedar needles whispered together. S-H-H-H-H-H-H. The sound flowed through the clearing like a quiet blessing. Samuel smiled. Some people hug old trees. I simply stand beside them. They remind me that strength doesn't come from rushing. It comes from standing faithfully through every season. Ethan nodded. He thought about the old windmill, the ancient lavender field, the lonely lighthouse. Every peaceful place had shared the same lesson in its own unique way. Patience. As they rested beneath the grand cedar, Samuel reached into his satchel and offered Ethan a small cloth pouch. Inside were roasted cedar, nuts mixed with wild forest berries. A simple afternoon snack. The nuts were warm, lightly salted, and surprisingly sweet. Nearby, a tiny red fox appeared at the edge of the clearing. It looked toward them curiously for a brief moment before quietly disappearing into the tall ferns. Samuel chuckled softly. The forest likes to introduce its neighbors. After a while, Samuel stood and pointed toward a narrow path almost hidden by moss and ferns. Beyond those rocks, the spring awaits. The place where Whispering Falls begins its endless journey. The sound of flowing water grew clearer with every step. Not louder, just purer, gentler, as though the forest itself were breathing. Ethan followed Samuel along the hidden trail. Ahead, soft mist drifted between the ancient cedar trunks. Somewhere beyond it, a secret known only to patient travelers had been waiting for centuries. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 6. The hidden trail became softer beneath their feet. Instead of stones, the ground was covered with a thick carpet of emerald moss. Each step felt light and quiet. The forest seemed to welcome them deeper into its peaceful heart. The air grew noticeably cooler. Tiny droplets of mist floated gently between the ancient cedar trunks. They sparkled whenever a beam of sunlight found its way through the canopy. Samuel slowed his pace. We're almost there. He spoke so softly that his voice blended naturally with the sounds around him. Cedar walked a little ahead, his golden tail swaying lazily from side to side. Every so often, he paused to look back, making sure Ethan was still following. The gentle stream they had been following became narrower. Its clear water now flowed between smooth white stones covered in soft green moss. Small ferns leaned over its banks. Delicate white flowers bloomed wherever the sunlight touched the ground. The sound of flowing water became quieter, not because there was less water, but because it flowed with perfect calm. After rounding a cluster of enormous boulders, Samuel stopped. He smiled. We've arrived. Ethan stepped forward. Before him lay one of the most peaceful places he had ever seen. Hidden beneath the towering cedar trees was a crystal clear spring. The water bubbled gently from beneath a bed of smooth granite stones. It was so clear that every pebble at the bottom could be seen perfectly. Tiny silver fish drifted lazily through the shallow water. Dragonflies hovered above the surface. Wild orchids and moss surrounded the spring, creating a natural garden untouched by time. Sunlight filtered through the cedar branches overhead, painting shimmering patterns across the water. It looked almost magical. The little spring overflowed quietly into a narrow stream. That stream continued through the forest, gathering strength, until it finally became Whispering Falls. Samuel knelt beside the spring. "This," he said gently, "is where every drop begins. No matter how great the waterfall becomes, it never forgets this quiet place." Ethan knelt beside him. He cupped his hands and lifted a little of the cool spring water. It was fresh beyond anything he had ever tasted. Pure, refreshing, almost sweet. Samuel smiled. "My grandmother used to tell me, every peaceful life begins like this spring. Small, quiet, easy to overlook. But if it keeps flowing with kindness, it can become something truly beautiful." Ethan watched the water bubble endlessly from beneath the stones. It never hurried. It never stopped. It simply continued, patiently, faithfully. Nearby stood a weathered wooden bench beneath an ancient cedar tree. The bench faced the spring. No roads reached this place. No signs pointed toward it. Only those willing to walk slowly through the forest could ever find it. Samuel and Ethan sat together in silence. Cedar lay comfortably beside them, resting his head upon his paws. A robin landed on a nearby branch and began to sing. Its cheerful melody echoed softly through the forest. The breeze carried the clean scent of cedar needles and fresh water. The spring continued its gentle song. For a long while, no one spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. The quiet itself felt complete. Finally, Samuel reached into his satchel and carefully removed a tiny glass bottle with a smooth cork stopper. He filled it with crystal clear spring water and handed it to Ethan. A small gift. When life feels noisy, look at this water. You don't have to drink it. Simply remember where it came from. A quiet beginning. Ethan accepted the little bottle with gratitude. He carefully wrapped it in a soft cloth and placed it inside his backpack beside the tiny wooden windmill from Benjamin. Another keepsake. Another peaceful lesson. As the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted through the towering cedars, Samuel stood with a gentle smile. "There is one more place I'd like you to see before evening. A bridge hidden above the waterfall, where the forest whispers most clearly." Together, Ethan, Samuel, and Cedar followed the winding trail once more, leaving the quiet spring behind as its crystal waters continued their timeless journey toward Whispering Falls. Episode 6. The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 7. Leaving the hidden spring behind, Ethan followed Samuel along a narrow woodland path that climbed gently through the cedar forest. The little stream flowed beside them, growing wider with every turn. Its clear water skipped happily over smooth stones, gathering strength as it continued its quiet journey. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the towering cedar branches, creating long golden beams that danced across the moss-covered ground. The forest seemed brighter now, warmer, yet it remained wonderfully peaceful. Cedar trotted ahead with quiet confidence. Every few moments he stopped, looked back, and wagged his tail, making sure his two companions were close behind. Samuel smiled. He knows every trail in this forest. I sometimes think he could find his way home with his eyes closed. Ethan laughed softly. I'm beginning to believe that. As they continued climbing, the sound of the waterfall slowly returned. Rush, pause, rush, pause. But this time, it sounded different. Stronger. Closer. The path curved around a massive cedar whose roots gripped the hillside like gentle hands. Beyond it stood a graceful wooden bridge. It stretched across a deep rocky gorge where the stream leaped into the valley below, becoming Whispering Falls. The bridge was built from dark cedar planks, polished smooth by countless footsteps and many seasons of rain. Flowering vines climbed along its wooden railings. Tiny white blossoms swayed gently in the breeze. A small carved sign welcomed visitors. Bridge of Echoes. Below it, another line had been carefully engraved. Asterisk. The forest returns every kind word you give it. Asterisk. Ethan rested his hands on the smooth railing. Far below, the waterfall poured into the turquoise pool he had visited earlier that morning. From above, the scene looked even more breathtaking. Mist rose gently from the cliffs, catching the afternoon sunlight. A faint rainbow shimmered above the falling water. Birds glided effortlessly through the cool air rising from the gorge. Samuel leaned quietly against the railing. When I was a child, I believed these echoes belonged to the mountains. He smiled, but my grandfather told me something different. He said, "The mountains never repeat our words. They repeat our hearts." Ethan looked thoughtfully into the valley below. Samuel continued, "If you arrive with anger, the forest feels heavy. If you arrive with gratitude, everything seems brighter. The world often reflects what we quietly carry inside." A cool breeze swept through the gorge. The cedar branches whispered together. The waterfall answered with its endless melody. For a long moment, Ethan simply listened. He realized that every peaceful place on his journey had shared the same truth in a different voice. The river had taught him to keep moving. The lighthouse had taught him to guide others with kindness. The mountain lake had taught him stillness. The lavender valley had taught him patience. And now, the cedar forest was teaching him awareness. To notice the beauty that had always been there, Samuel reached into his satchel and unfolded a small cloth. Inside were slices of fresh apple, roasted cedar nuts, and a tiny jar of wildflower honey. They shared the simple snack while sitting on a wooden bench beside the bridge. Nothing tasted extraordinary, yet everything tasted perfect, perhaps because they were in no hurry. As the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, the golden sunlight softened into warm shades of amber. Long shadows stretched across the forest floor. Samuel stood and smiled gently. The waterfall changes as the sun begins to set. The evening light paints the mist with colors most travelers never see. He looked toward the western sky, where the first hints of sunset were beginning to appear. Come, there's a quiet overlook just beyond the bridge. It's my favorite place to end the day. Together, Ethan, Samuel, and Cedar crossed the Bridge of Echoes, walking toward a hidden viewpoint where the whispering waterfall would soon glow beneath the colors of the setting sun. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall in the Cedar Forest. Part 8. The three companions crossed the Bridge of Echoes at an unhurried pace. Each wooden plank creaked softly beneath their footsteps. Behind them, the whispering waterfall continued its endless song. Ahead, the trail curved gently around the cliffside. Wild moss covered the ancient rocks. Small clusters of white lilies bloomed wherever tiny streams trickled from the hillside. The air became cooler. Mist floated lazily through the cedar trees, giving the forest a dreamlike appearance. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. Its warm golden light filtered through the branches, turning every floating droplet into tiny sparks of light. Cedar paused beside a patch of ferns. He looked toward the trees and wagged his tail. A family of rabbits quietly emerged from the undergrowth. They nibbled on fresh grass for a few peaceful moments before disappearing once again into the forest. Samuel smiled. The animals always know when evening is near. They prepare for rest without anyone reminding them. Ethan looked up at the towering cedars. Their branches swayed gently in the cool breeze. Nothing in the forest resisted the changing day. Everything simply moved with nature's rhythm. Soon the trail widened into a rocky overlook. A simple wooden bench stood near the edge. It faced the waterfall from above. Samuel spread a small wool blanket across the bench. This is Sunset Overlook. I've ended many days here. Ethan sat beside him. Before them, Whispering Falls cascaded gracefully into the valley below. The afternoon sunlight slowly transformed into shades of amber, rose, and soft violet. The drifting mist caught every color. For a few magical moments, the waterfall appeared to glow from within. The turquoise pool below reflected the sky like polished glass. Tiny ripples spread gently across its surface. Birds circled above the cliffs before returning to their nests. Far away, the first evening stars began to appear in the deepening blue sky. Samuel quietly removed a small wooden flute from his satchel. It had been carved from cedar many years ago. Simple, smooth, beautiful. He lifted it to his lips. A gentle melody drifted into the evening air. Soft, slow, peaceful. The notes blended perfectly with the whispering waterfall. The music did not overpower nature. It became part of it. Ethan closed his eyes. The waterfall, the flute, the breeze, the scent of cedar. Everything seemed to breathe together. When the melody ended, the forest remained silent for a long moment. Then a single robin answered with a cheerful song. Samuel smiled. The forest always responds. He carefully placed the flute back into his satchel. My father carved that flute for me when I was 12. He told me, never play louder than the forest. Let your music become its companion. Ethan looked across the glowing valley. Those words reminded him of every lesson he had learned since beginning his journey. Peace was never about escaping the world. It was about learning to live gently within it. The sun slowly disappeared behind the distant mountains. Golden light faded into deep lavender and blue. The waterfall continued flowing exactly as before. Unhurried, faithful, timeless. Samuel stood and looked toward the forest path leading back to the cottage. Tonight, we'll light a small fire beside the waterfall. My grandmother believed every traveler should hear its song beneath the stars at least once. Ethan smiled. Another unforgettable evening awaited. One where firelight, glowing water, and the quiet cedar forest would share one final story before a new day began. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 9. As the last glow of sunset faded beyond the mountains, a gentle twilight settled over the cedar forest. The sky deepened into shades of indigo and violet. One by one, the first stars appeared above the towering treetops. The cool evening breeze carried the refreshing scent of cedar needles and damp earth. Together, Samuel, Ethan, and Cedar followed a winding trail back toward Whispering Falls. The waterfall shimmered beneath the rising moon. Its white ribbons of water glowed softly against the dark gray cliffs. The mist drifting above the pool reflected the silver moonlight like floating silk. Near the edge of the water stood a small stone fire ring. Several smooth cedar logs had already been stacked neatly beside it. Samuel smiled. My grandfather built this little campfire place many years ago. He believed every traveler deserves one peaceful evening beside the falls. He carefully arranged the wood. With a single match, a tiny flame appeared. Slowly, the fire came alive. Crackle, pause, crackle, pause. Its warm orange light danced across the nearby stones. The glow reflected gently upon the still water. Cedar curled up comfortably beside the fire, resting his head on his paws. His eyes slowly closed as he listened to the familiar sound of the waterfall. Samuel placed a black iron kettle above the flames. Tonight's tea was different. Fresh cedar needles, wild chamomile, a little mountain honey, and a few fragrant forest berries. Soon, sweet-smelling steam drifted into the cool night air. The comforting aroma mixed beautifully with the scent of the surrounding forest. Ethan wrapped both hands around the warm clay cup Samuel handed him. The tea tasted rich and soothing. It carried the quiet freshness of the mountains. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled gently. The waterfall whispered endlessly. Somewhere deep in the forest, an owl called softly. Who? Pause. Who? Above them, the stars grew brighter with every passing minute. The Milky Way stretched across the clear night sky like a river of silver dust. Samuel looked upward with a peaceful smile. When I was a boy, I thought every star was a campfire. My grandfather would laugh and tell me, perhaps someone, somewhere, is sitting beside each one. Ethan smiled at the thought. It made the night sky feel strangely welcoming. Samuel reached into his satchel and removed a small cedar box. Inside were smooth river pebbles. Each one had a single word carefully carved into its surface. Hope, patience, kindness, gratitude, wonder. He gently spread them across a flat stone beside the fire. Every traveler chooses one before leaving, not because the stone has magic, but because sometimes a single word is enough to guide an entire journey. Ethan slowly looked at each pebble. Every word felt meaningful, yet one seemed to shine a little brighter in his heart. Wonder. He picked it up carefully. Its smooth surface felt cool against his fingertips. Samuel nodded approvingly. A beautiful choice. The world never runs out of beautiful things, but we sometimes stop noticing them. Ethan slipped the little pebble into his backpack beside the tiny wooden windmill, the spring water bottle, and the other keepsakes from his travels. Another simple gift. Another quiet lesson. The campfire burned lower. Bright orange embers glowed softly among the ashes. Tiny sparks floated upward before disappearing into the star-filled sky. Samuel smiled gently. Tomorrow morning, I'll take you to one last place. A hidden meadow where the first sunlight touches the cedar forest. It's where every farewell begins with gratitude. Ethan looked toward the softly glowing waterfall. Its endless whispers seemed to promise another peaceful morning. The night grew deeper. The fire became smaller, but the warmth of the forest remained all around them, like an old friend quietly watching over every traveler beneath the stars. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 10. The campfires slowly faded into a bed of glowing embers. Above the cedar forest, the stars shone brighter than ever. The waterfall continued its gentle whisper throughout the night. Rush, pause, rush, pause. Its timeless melody blended with the soft chirping of crickets and the distant call of an owl. Ethan sat quietly beside the fire, watching tiny sparks drift upward into the cool night sky. For the first time in many days, he wasn't thinking about where he would travel next. He was simply grateful for where he was. Samuel noticed the peaceful smile on Ethan's face. The forest has become familiar to you. Ethan nodded. It feels as though I've known this place for years. Samuel looked toward the waterfall. That's what peaceful places often do. They welcome you so gently that your heart forgets they were ever unfamiliar. The old forest keeper reached into his coat pocket and carefully unfolded a faded photograph. Its edges were worn with age. The picture showed a much younger Samuel standing beside Whispering Falls. Next to him stood an elderly man with kind eyes and a broad smile. "My father," Samuel said softly. He was the keeper of these woods before me. Ethan studied the photograph. The waterfall looked almost exactly the same. The cedar trees had hardly changed. Only time had quietly passed. Samuel smiled. "My father taught me something on my very first day here. He placed a tiny cedar seed in my hand, and he said, 'Never measure a forest by the number of trees you see today. Measure it by the shade it will give someone you will never meet.'" Ethan looked around at the towering cedars surrounding them. Many had been planted by hands that were now long gone, yet they continued offering shelter, fresh air, beauty, and peace, without asking for anything in return. The realization settled gently into his heart. Kindness could be like a cedar tree, something planted today that someone else might enjoy many years later. The last embers of the fire flickered softly. Samuel carefully poured water over the remaining coals. A cloud of warm steam rose briefly before disappearing into the cool night air. The forest has shared its warmth. Now we return the ground exactly as we found it. Soon, the fire ring looked untouched once again. Only the waterfall remained, always flowing, always whispering. Together, they walked slowly back toward the cedar cottage beneath the silver moonlight. Cedar trotted happily beside them. The forest path shimmered with tiny fireflies dancing among the ferns. The cottage windows glowed warmly through the trees. Inside, Samuel lit a small oil lamp. Its gentle light filled the room with a peaceful golden glow. He placed the faded photograph back inside an old cedar chest. Beside it rested dozens of journals, letters, maps, and little keepsakes left by travelers over many decades. Samuel smiled. Every traveler leaves something behind. Sometimes it's a gift. Sometimes it's only a memory. But the forest keeps them all. Before going to bed, Ethan stepped outside one last time. The moon reflected perfectly in the quiet pool beneath Whispering Falls. The cedar branches swayed gently overhead. The air smelled fresh and clean. He placed one hand on the smooth wooden railing outside the cottage, closed his eyes, and simply listened. The waterfall, the breeze, the trees, the peaceful heartbeat of the forest. Tomorrow would be his final morning here. Samuel had promised to show him the hidden meadow where the first rays of sunrise touched the cedar forest, a place where every farewell began, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 11, Before Dawn. The cedar forest rested beneath a blanket of gentle mist. The moon still lingered above the treetops, though its silver light was beginning to fade. Everything was quiet, peacefully quiet. Ethan awoke to the familiar whisper of the waterfall. Rush, pause, rush, pause. It had become the forest's morning greeting. He stepped outside the cottage. The air was cool and wonderfully fresh. Tiny drops of dew clung to every fern and wildflower. The scent of cedar drifted gently through the stillness. Samuel was already waiting near the wooden gate. A small lantern rested in his hand. Its warm glow softly illuminated the narrow forest path. Cedar stood beside him, stretching lazily before wagging his tail. Samuel smiled. The forest always wakes before the sun. If we leave now, we'll reach the meadow just in time. Together, they began walking through the quiet woodland. The trail was familiar now. Moss softened every footstep. The towering cedar trees stood like silent guardians watching over the sleeping forest. Only the occasional chirp of an early bird broke the silence. The eastern sky slowly changed. Deep blue gave way to soft shades of lavender and pale gold. Mist drifted between the ancient trunks like slow-moving clouds. The forest felt almost enchanted. After nearly half an hour, the trees gradually became thinner. Ahead, warm light spilled gently through the branches. They stepped out of the forest and into a hidden meadow. Ethan stopped in quiet amazement. The meadow stretched peacefully before him. Tall wild grasses swayed gently in the morning breeze. White daisies, bluebells, golden buttercups, and tiny purple flowers covered the landscape. Every blade of grass shimmered with sparkling dew. At the center of the meadow stood a single enormous cedar tree. Its wide branches stretched gracefully toward the brightening sky. Beneath it rested a simple wooden bench. Samuel smiled softly. This is Sunrise Meadow. My father brought me here on my first morning as forest keeper, and every keeper since has welcomed the sunrise from this very place. They sat together beneath the ancient cedar. The world remained perfectly still. Then, the first ray of sunlight appeared above the distant mountains. Golden light slowly flowed across the meadow. It touched the wildflowers first, then the grasses, then the branches of the great cedar tree. Finally, it reached Ethan and Samuel. The entire meadow glowed with warm morning light. Tiny spider webs hidden among the flowers sparkled like strands of silver. Butterflies awakened one by one. A family of songbirds flew from the cedar tree into the brightening sky. Cedar lay quietly beside the bench, enjoying the warmth of the first sunlight. Samuel spoke in little more than a whisper. My father used to say, every sunrise is proof that the world believes in beginning again. He looked toward the glowing horizon. No matter what happened yesterday, morning always arrives with hope. Ethan watched the sunlight slowly spread across the meadow. He thought about every place he had visited. The Whispering River, the lonely lighthouse, the silent mountain lake, the lavender valley, and now, the Whispering Waterfall and the cedar forest. Each place had welcomed him. Each place had quietly changed him. Samuel reached into his pocket and handed Ethan a small cedar seed, no larger than a fingernail. Take this. You may never plant it, but keep it as a reminder. The smallest beginnings often grow into the greatest gifts. Ethan held the tiny seed carefully in his palm. It seemed so small, yet one day, it could become a towering cedar tree offering shade to generations yet to come. The morning breeze stirred gently across Sunrise Meadow. The forest behind them whispered softly. The day had only just begun, yet Ethan already knew he would never forget this peaceful dawn. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 12. The morning sun climbed a little higher above Sunrise Meadow. Its golden light spread across the wildflowers, warming the dew-covered grass until tiny droplets disappeared one by one. A gentle breeze moved through the meadow. The tall grasses swayed together like quiet waves upon a green sea. Ethan and Samuel remained seated beneath the ancient cedar tree. Neither of them wished to hurry. The peaceful silence felt like another lesson the forest was quietly offering. Nearby, Cedar lifted his head as a pair of bluebirds landed on the lower branches above them. Their cheerful songs echoed across the meadow. Soon, dozens of butterflies floated among the wildflowers, their colorful wings glowing in the morning sunlight. Samuel smiled. Every morning begins with a concert. The birds sing, the wind answers, and the flowers dance. Ethan laughed softly. I've never thought of nature that way. Samuel nodded. Most people hear sounds, but when you slow down, you begin hearing harmony. For several minutes, they simply listened. The rustling grass, the singing birds, the distant whisper of the waterfall hidden beyond the cedar trees. Even the buzzing bees seemed to move with perfect rhythm. Finally, Samuel stood. There is one last tradition I'd like to share. He led Ethan to the center of the meadow. There, a small circle of smooth white stones surrounded a young cedar sapling no taller than Ethan's knee. A tiny wooden sign stood beside it. It read, "For tomorrow's travelers." Samuel gently brushed a fallen leaf away from the little tree. Every forest keeper plants one cedar each spring, not for themselves, but for those who will visit long after they're gone. He handed Ethan a small wooden watering cup filled with fresh spring water. This year's sapling has been waiting. Ethan slowly poured the clear water around the young cedar's roots. The soil absorbed it quietly. No grand ceremony, no applause, only a simple act of care. Samuel smiled with quiet satisfaction. One day, this little tree will offer shade to someone you've never met. Perhaps another traveler, perhaps a child, perhaps someone searching for peace. Ethan looked at the tiny sapling. It seemed almost impossible that something so small could one day become as mighty as the grand cedar they had visited yesterday. Yet he knew it was true. Great things often began quietly. As they turned to leave, a gentle breeze passed through Sunrise Meadow. The young cedar swayed lightly. Its tiny branches shimmered in the sunlight. Samuel looked toward the forest. My father believed the forest always says thank you, not with words, but with growing. They began walking back toward the cottage. The morning had become brighter. Warm sunlight now filled every corner of the cedar forest. Along the trail, wild strawberries ripened beneath leafy vines. Chipmunks darted playfully between fallen logs. Dragonflies skimmed across the little stream that flowed toward Whispering Falls. When they reached the Bridge of Echoes once more, Ethan paused. He looked down into the gorge. The waterfall sparkled brilliantly beneath the morning sun. Its gentle whispers seemed different now, not because the waterfall had changed, but because he had. Samuel noticed his thoughtful smile. The forest teaches quietly, but its lessons stay for a lifetime. Ethan nodded. I think I'll always hear this waterfall, even after I leave. Samuel placed a kind hand on his shoulder. That's when you'll know. The forest has become part of you. Ahead, the Cedar cottage came into view through the trees. Smoke curled gently from its chimney. The scent of fresh bread and herbal tea drifted through the crisp morning air. One peaceful afternoon remained before Ethan's journey continued, and Samuel had one final gift waiting, a gift that every traveler carried not in their backpack, but in their heart. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall in the Cedar Forest. Part 13. The Cedar cottage welcomed them with its familiar warmth. Fresh bread had just come out of the small stone oven. Its comforting aroma filled the air. Samuel placed a kettle over the fireplace while Ethan opened the windows facing the waterfall. Immediately, the gentle whisper of the falling water drifted into the room. Rush, pause, rush, pause. It had become as familiar as a friend's voice. Cedar settled on his favorite woven rug beside the fireplace, letting out a long, contented sigh before closing his eyes. Samuel smiled. He always knows when it's time to rest. On the wooden table, Samuel arranged a simple midday meal. Warm cedar bread, fresh mountain butter, wildflower honey, forest berries, creamy goat cheese, and slices of crisp green apples. Everything had been gathered nearby. Nothing extravagant, yet everything felt special. They ate slowly, enjoying every bite. Outside, sunlight filtered through the cedar branches, casting gentle patterns across the cottage floor. After the meal, Samuel carried 2 cups of herbal tea onto the porch. The rocking chairs overlooked Whispering Falls. Mist rose gently from the cliffs, sparkling beneath the afternoon sun. For a long while, they simply rocked back and forth in peaceful silence. Finally, Samuel spoke. When I first became the forest keeper, I thought my duty was to protect the forest. He smiled quietly, but after many years, I realized something. The forest had been protecting me all along. Ethan looked toward the towering cedar trees. He understood. Every peaceful place had offered him shelter in a different way. The river had calmed his restless thoughts. The lighthouse had given him hope. The mountain lake had shown him stillness. The lavender valley had taught him patience. And now, the cedar forest had reminded him to live gently. Samuel stood and walked inside. A few moments later, he returned carrying a beautifully carved wooden box. Its lid showed a waterfall flowing beneath ancient cedar trees. Tiny birds had been carved into the branches above. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Samuel placed it carefully on the table. This belonged to my father, and before him, to my grandfather. He slowly opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of folded letters. Each was tied with a small piece of natural twine. Some papers had yellowed with age. Others looked much newer. Ethan looked at them curiously. Samuel smiled. Every traveler who stayed here wrote one letter. Not to another person, but to their future self. Ethan looked surprised. My future self? Samuel nodded. When life becomes busy, when worries return, when you forget what these peaceful places have taught you, you open your letter, and you remember. Samuel gently handed Ethan a sheet of handmade paper and a cedar wood pencil. You don't have to write much, only what your heart wishes your future to remember. Ethan thought quietly for a moment. Then he began writing. Not quickly, not perfectly, just honestly. He wrote about the whispering waterfall, the hidden spring, the bridge of echoes, the sunrise meadow, the scent of cedar after morning rain, the kindness of Samuel, and one simple promise to himself. No matter how busy life becomes, asterisk, I will always make time to walk gently. Asterisk. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully. Samuel sealed it inside a small cedar envelope. He smiled. Keep it hidden. And one day, open it when you need these forests again. Ethan placed the letter safely inside his backpack. Not among the keepsakes, but inside a separate pocket. Some treasures were meant to be discovered only at the right moment. Outside, the afternoon breeze stirred the cedar branches once again. The waterfall continued whispering its timeless song. Tomorrow morning, it would be time to say goodbye. But tonight, one final peaceful evening remained in the heart of the cedar forest. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 14. The afternoon slowly melted into evening. Warm golden sunlight drifted through the cedar branches, painting the forest with soft shades of amber and honey. Long shadows stretched across the moss-covered ground. The whispering waterfall sparkled beneath the fading light. Rush, pause, rush, pause. Its gentle rhythm had become as familiar as the beating of Ethan's own heart. Samuel stood on the cottage porch, watching the western sky. The forest always gives its finest goodbye, he said softly. It never rushes the sunset. Ethan smiled. I've noticed. Every beautiful place on this journey seems to know how to say goodbye. Samuel nodded. Perhaps that's why we remember them. Together, they followed a narrow trail that led to a small clearing beside the waterfall. Unlike the overlook they had visited before, this place rested at the water's edge. Flat stones formed a natural terrace beside the crystal-clear pool. Wild ferns surrounded the clearing. Clusters of white woodland flowers swayed gently in the evening breeze. Samuel carried a small woven basket. Inside were several floating lanterns, each carefully made from thin cedar wood and rice paper. Their delicate sides were painted with tiny cedar branches, waterfalls, and birds in flight. Ethan looked at them with curiosity. Samuel smiled warmly. My grandmother began this tradition. On a traveler's final evening, we thanked the forest. He handed Ethan one of the lanterns. Alongside it was a tiny piece of handmade paper and a charcoal pencil. You don't have to write a wish. Only one thing you're thankful for. Ethan thought quietly. Then he wrote, asterisk, thank you for teaching me that peace is found in the quiet moments we choose to notice. Asterisk. He folded the paper and gently placed it inside the lantern. Samuel wrote his own message without speaking. When they were both finished, they walked to the edge of the calm pool beneath the waterfall. The current there was gentle, just strong enough to carry the lanterns downstream. Samuel lit the small candle inside Ethan's lantern. Then he lit his own. The two tiny flames glowed softly against the gathering twilight. Together, They lowered the lanterns onto the water. For a moment, they floated side by side. Then the gentle current carried them away. Slowly, gracefully, their reflections shimmered beneath the evening sky. The waterfall whispered above them. The lanterns drifted beneath the mist. It felt as though the forest itself had accepted their quiet words of gratitude. Neither Ethan nor Samuel spoke. Some moments were too meaningful for conversation. As darkness settled over the cedar forest, hundreds of tiny fireflies began appearing among the ferns. Their golden lights blinked gently around the pool. The floating lanterns and the fireflies seemed to dance together upon the water. Cedar watched quietly from the shore, his tail gently brushing the soft grass. High above, the first stars appeared between the cedar branches. The evening breeze carried the cool scent of fresh water and cedar needles. Samuel looked toward the glowing lanterns as they disappeared around a bend in the stream. My grandfather used to say, "Gratitude is like a lantern. It may seem small, but it brightens every path ahead." Ethan smiled. He knew he would remember those words for a very long time. The forest had given him many gifts. Not objects, not treasures, but ways of seeing the world more gently. They slowly turned back toward the cottage. Tomorrow morning would be Ethan's final sunrise in the cedar forest, and Samuel had promised one last farewell before the journey continued toward another peaceful destination. Behind them, the two lanterns floated quietly into the night, carrying thankful hearts along the same gentle stream that began at the hidden spring. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 15. The cedar forest slept peacefully beneath a sky filled with countless stars. The floating lanterns had long disappeared downstream, but their warm glow seemed to linger in Ethan's thoughts. Inside the cottage, the fire burned low. Outside, Whispering Falls continued its endless song. Rush, pause, rush, pause. Before dawn, Ethan awoke naturally. He quietly stepped outside. The forest was wrapped in a soft blanket of silver mist. Every cedar branch held tiny drops of dew. The air was cool, fresh, and wonderfully still. Samuel was already waiting near the little wooden bridge. In his hand rested a small cloth bundle tied with a green cedar ribbon. He smiled warmly. "I thought we could take one last walk." Together, Ethan, Samuel, and Cedar wandered slowly along the familiar trail. They crossed the Bridge of Echoes, past the hidden spring, walked beneath the towering Grand Cedar, and finally arrived at Whispering Falls one last time. The morning light had only just begun to touch the top of the cliffs. Golden rays slowly drifted downward until they reached the falling water. The waterfall shimmered like flowing crystal. Mist rose gently into the cool air, forming a delicate rainbow above the pool. Everything looked exactly as it had on Ethan's first morning. Yet everything felt different, because he had changed. Samuel stood quietly beside the water. The forest never asks anyone to stay. It only hopes they'll carry its peace wherever they go. He handed Ethan the small cloth bundle. Inside was a beautifully carved cedar bookmark. Its top was shaped like a tiny cedar tree. The lower half carried delicate carvings of flowing water. Across the center, carefully engraved in elegant letters, were the words, "Walk gently, listen deeply." Ethan ran his fingers across the smooth wood. It was simple, beautiful, a gift that could easily fit inside any book, yet it carried the spirit of the entire forest. Samuel smiled. My father carved bookmarks for travelers. He believed every good story deserves a peaceful reminder. Ethan carefully placed the bookmark inside the leather journal he carried in his backpack. It would remain there until his next quiet evening of writing. For a while, they stood together without speaking. The waterfall whispered. The cedars swayed. Birds welcomed a new day. Even Cedar seemed unusually calm, sitting quietly beside Samuel with his eyes fixed on the flowing water. Then Samuel reached into his pocket and gently placed a small bronze key in Ethan's hand. The key was old and beautifully worn. A tiny cedar leaf had been engraved on its handle. Ethan looked at him in surprise. What does it open? Samuel smiled softly. It opens nothing. At least, nothing made of wood or stone. He gently closed Ethan's fingers around it. My grandfather gave it to me. My father gave it to me again before he passed. And now, I'd like you to carry it. Ethan looked puzzled. Samuel continued. They called it the key of quiet hearts. It reminds us that peace is never locked away. We simply forget where to look. When life becomes noisy, hold the key and remember this forest. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood. The value of the gift wasn't in the bronze. It was in the meaning behind it. He carefully placed the little key beside the cedar seed, the spring water bottle, the tiny wooden windmill, and the other keepsakes from his journey. His backpack had become more than luggage. It had become a collection of gentle lessons. Samuel looked toward the brightening sky. The morning is waiting. So is your next path. Far beyond the cedar forest, another peaceful destination rested somewhere beyond the distant mountains. Its story had not yet been told, but Ethan could already feel it quietly calling. Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Part 16, Finale. The first rays of sunlight slipped gently through the towering cedar trees. Golden light danced across the forest floor, where tiny drops of dew sparkled like scattered diamonds. Whispering Falls continued its timeless melody. Rush, pause, rush, pause. Ethan stood quietly at the edge of the pool one final time. He closed his eyes. The cool mist brushed against his face. The scent of cedar filled the morning air. For a few peaceful moments, he simply listened, not to the waterfall alone, but to the silence between each rushing wave. It was there he realized that the forest had been teaching him all along. Samuel smiled as if he understood exactly what Ethan had discovered. The loudest lessons, he said softly, are rarely the deepest ones. The forest speaks quietly, so only a peaceful heart can hear it. Ethan opened his eyes. I don't think I'll ever forget this place. Samuel nodded. You won't. Not because you'll remember every tree, but because you'll remember how you felt while walking among them. Cedar, the faithful golden retriever, walked over and gently rested his head against Ethan's hand. Ethan laughed softly and scratched behind his ears. I'll miss you too. The old dog wagged his tail once, then sat beside Samuel once again, content to watch another traveler continue his journey. A cool breeze drifted through the cedar branches. Thousands of leaves whispered together. For just a moment, it almost sounded like a chorus of gentle voices saying farewell. Samuel looked toward the winding trail leading east. My grandfather used to tell me something whenever a traveler left. He smiled warmly. I'd like to share it with you. He spoke slowly, allowing each word to settle like a leaf upon still water. May your footsteps remain gentle, even when the road becomes difficult. May your heart stay quiet, even when the world grows loud. May you always find clear water when your spirit becomes weary, and wherever you wander, may you leave every place more peaceful than you found it. The blessing lingered in the cool morning air. Ethan placed one hand over his heart. Thank you, not just for the words, but for every sunrise, every quiet walk, every lesson hidden inside the forest. Samuel simply smiled. Then the forest has done its work. Together they walked back to the little wooden bridge where Ethan's journey had begun. The bridge looked exactly the same, yet Ethan no longer crossed it as someone searching for peace. He crossed it carrying peace with him. Before stepping onto the path beyond the forest, he opened his leather journal. Between its pages rested the Cedar bookmark. He turned to a fresh page and carefully wrote, Episode 6, The Whispering Waterfall and the Cedar Forest. Beneath the title, he added, The world becomes quieter when we learn to listen. He closed the journal. The carved cedar bookmark remained inside, gently marking the lesson he never wanted to lose. As Ethan continued along the forest trail, he glanced once more at the treasures in his backpack. The smooth river stone, the white seashell, the tiny wooden windmill, the little bottle of spring water, the cedar seed, the beautifully carved cedar bookmark, and the bronze key of quiet hearts. Each gift was small enough to fit in his hands, yet each carried a lesson far greater than itself. By the time the sun climbed above the mountains, the cedar forest had begun to disappear behind him. Only the distant sound of the waterfall remained. Rush, pause, rush, pause. Soon, even that gentle music faded into the wind. Ahead, the road wound toward distant blue mountains, where another story patiently waited. A place where hopes were tied gently to ancient branches, where wishes were whispered instead of spoken. Ethan smiled. Every destination had given him a gift. The river had taught him to let go. The sea had taught him to trust. The windmill had taught him that even small acts could spread joy. And the cedar forest had taught him that peace is not something we find in a place. It is something we carry within ourselves. Sometimes, the world feels overwhelming, too loud, too fast, too full of worries we cannot control. But somewhere inside every heart, there is a quiet forest, a gentle waterfall, a peaceful path waiting to be walked. All we have to do is slow down long enough to hear it. As Ethan disappeared beyond the cedar trees, a single breeze passed softly through the forest. The towering cedars swayed together one last time, and Whispering Falls continued its endless song, not for travelers who had already arrived, but for those who had not yet discovered the courage to listen. End of episode 6.